The Concordance of Nine met in the drowned amphitheater beneath the moon city of Ves, where light came filtered through kilometers of glass and slow water, and where no species that had ever lost a war was permitted to speak. That last rule had been written into the Concordance's founding charter 11,000 years before, and in all that time it had never needed enforcing, because the Concordance had never lost. Its member species had between them conquered, absorbed, or quietly extinguished every rival civilization to arise in the galactic arm they called the Well. They did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as gardeners, and the galaxy as a garden that required, from time to time, the removal of things that grew wrong. Humanity had grown wrong. That was the finding, at least, of the assessor caste, whose long violet limbs and mirrored eyes made them look, to the few humans who had ever seen one, like standing lakes given the ability to judge. The chief assessor was named Vanti Soon, and she had spent 40 of her years studying the small blue world at the far end of a spiral of dead stars, and she had come to the amphitheater on this day to recommend the thing the Concordance did perhaps once a century. She had come to recommend erasure. They are 800 years into their space flight, she said, and her voice, translated into the low chiming speech of the council, carried to every tier of the drowned seats. Which is to say, they are children. They have colonized 4 systems. They have no gravitic weaponry. They have never fought a war above their own atmosphere. By every measure the Concordance has ever used, they are beneath consideration. A murmur moved through the council like wind through reeds. The representative of the Kell, an armored people who thought in terms of centuries and grudges, rasped a question. Then, why are they before us, assessor? We do not convene to discuss children. Vanti soon folded her limbs in the gesture that meant she was about to say something she did not enjoy saying. Because of what they are becoming, because their growth is not linear, as ours was, as every civilization's has been. It is exponential, and it is accelerating, and the models say that within 3 of their centuries they will be a rival to the Concordance itself. Within 5 they will surpass it. I have run the projection 900 times. It does not change. The only variable that changes the outcome is time. If we act now while they are children, the cost is trivial. If we wait, the cost is everything. She let the silence hold. Around her, in the tiered dark, 9 species considered the arithmetic of murder and found it, as they always found it, acceptable. It was the suzerain of the Harvek who finally spoke the word aloud. The Harvek were the oldest of the 9, and the most feared, a species of layered crystalline minds housed in bodies of woven light, and their suzerain had presided over the last 4 erasures the Concordance had performed. When it spoke, the water itself seemed to still. We will declare war upon them, it said. Openly, formally, as the charter requires. We will give them the full and traditional warning so that no one may say the Concordance struck without honor. And then we will remove their capacity to make war, their fleets and their yards and their weapons, in a single stroke, so completely that they will never again pose a threat to the garden. 3 days. That is what the charter grants a young species between declaration and execution. 3 days to compose themselves. 3 days to make peace with their small gods. The council chimed its assent, tier by tier, until the sound filled the drowned amphitheater like a bell rung underwater. And in the recording that would later be transmitted to Earth, as the charter required, the suzerain's final words were these. Let it be known to the species called human that the Concordance of 9 has judged them and found them unworthy of the future. In 3 of their days we will come. Compose yourselves. The declaration reached Earth at 04:17 Coordinated Solar Time, and it reached the desk of Lieutenant Commander Ilya Sorensen 40 minutes later, which was 39 minutes after she had already read it. She was 29 years old, which by the standards of the Terran Coordinated Command made her young for the room she was about to walk into. And she had gotten the raw feed before the analysts because she had written the interception protocol that caught the transmission, and because she almost never slept. She sat in the pale light of her workstation in the underground complex beneath the Ural Coordinated Facility, and she watched the suzerain of the Harvek tell her species to make peace with its gods, and she felt something that she would later have difficulty describing to the people who asked. She did not feel afraid. That was the strange part. She had expected to feel afraid. Instead, she felt something closer to recognition, the way you feel when a thing you have long suspected is finally spoken aloud. She had spent 6 years of her short career studying the concordance, building models of how it thought, how it moved, how it decided. She had written her thesis on the pattern of the erasures, the 4 that the archives recorded and the 11 that could be inferred from the absences, the civilizations that appeared in old star charts and then simply were not there anymore. She had argued to a review board that had found her conclusions alarmist, that the concordance did not conquer, it gardened, and that a garden did not negotiate with a weed. Now the weed had been named, and it was her. She watched the message 3 times. On the 3rd pass, she stopped listening to the words and started listening to the shape of them. The assumptions folded inside the confidence, and she began, very quietly, to smile. Not because the situation was funny, because the suzerain had made a mistake, and she was almost certain she was the only person on Earth who could see it yet. The mistake was the 3 days. She keyed her terminal and requested an emergency convening of the coordinated command. The request bounced back within the minute with a priority override. The command was already convening. Of course it was. She gathered her tablet and the single physical folder she carried everywhere, the one she was not supposed to have because its contents were compartmentalized above her clearance, and she walked toward the lift that would take her down to the war room, and she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother had been a chess player of the old kind, the kind who played on a board with her hands, and she had taught Ilya a thing when Ilya was 7 that Ilya had never forgotten. The most dangerous move on the board, her grandmother had said, is the one your opponent is certain you cannot make. Not because it is powerful, because he has built his whole plan on the certainty that it does not exist. And when it appears, he does not merely lose a piece. He loses his understanding of the game. The concordance was certain of a great many things. Ilya Sorensen was walking into the war room to explain, to a great many frightened admirals, which of those certainties was about to kill their enemies. The war room beneath the Urals was not large, and it was crowded, and it smelled of recycled air and fierce sweat, and the ozone tang of too many holographic displays running too hot. 40 of the most senior officers of the Terran Coordinated Command stood around the central table, and on the table floated the slow-turning image of the galactic arm called the Well, with the Concordance's 9 home systems marked in cold blue and Earth marked, alone, in a green that looked suddenly very fragile. The first coordinator was a woman named Adiz Okonkwo, and she had held the highest office in human space for 11 years, and she looked, in the light of the display, like a person who had aged a decade in a single morning. She was speaking when Ilya entered, and she did not stop, but her eyes flicked to the young officer and marked her arrival. "Which leaves us," Okonkwo was saying, "with 3 days and no fleet capable of meeting theirs. Let us not pretend otherwise. Admiral Rowe's assessment is correct. If we mass every ship we have at every yard we have, we can field perhaps 400 vessels against a concordance battle fleet that the last estimate placed at 11,000. This is not a war. This is an execution, and they have told us so themselves. So the question before this command is not how we win. The question is what we do with 3 days." "We evacuate," said Admiral Rowe. He was old and tired and honest, and Ilya respected him more than almost anyone in the room. "We take the sublight arcs we've been building for the colony program. We fill them with as many people as they'll hold, and we scatter them into the dark before the concordance arrives. We won't save many, but we save some. We save the species, even if we can't save the worlds." The silence that followed was the silence of people who had already had this thought and hated it. Ilya stepped forward. She had not been recognized to speak. She did it anyway. Coordinator, Admiral, with respect, we are answering the wrong question. 40 faces turned toward her. Okonkwo's expression did not change, but she raised one hand, a small gesture that meant let her speak, and the room grudgingly let her. Lieutenant Commander Sorensen, Okonkwo said, interception and analysis. You caught the transmission. Say your piece. Ilya set her folder on the edge of the great table, though she did not open it yet. The concordance has made a mistake, she said. A specific one. And if I'm right about it, we don't have 3 days to prepare a defense. We have 3 days to spring a trap that was set 11 years ago, before most of you knew the concordance existed, before I was even assigned to this facility. And the reason none of you know about it is that it was designed so that none of you would know about it, including me. I only found the edges of it because I've spent 6 years looking at exactly this. Admiral Rose's jaw tightened. Explain that slowly. So she did. The concordance doesn't conquer, Ilya began. It gardens. I wrote a paper on this that a review board threw out for being alarmist, so you can check my history and see I'm not making it up to sound clever now. When the concordance decides a species is a threat, it doesn't invade and occupy. That's expensive, and it makes martyrs, and it leaves survivors who remember. Instead, it does exactly what it just told us it will do. It declares war formally, honorably, per its own ancient charter. It gives the target 3 days, and then it destroys the target's capacity to ever make war again, in a single overwhelming strike, and then it leaves. It doesn't want our worlds. It doesn't want our people except gone. It wants our teeth pulled. It wants us to survive harmless as a lesson to everyone watching about what happens to things that grow wrong. We know this, said an admiral near the back. It's in the assessment. How does knowing it help us? Because, Ilya said, to pull our teeth in a single stroke they have to know where our teeth are, and they think they do. She opened the folder. 11 years earlier, before Ilya Sorensen had ever worn a uniform, a small and unglamorous office within the coordinated command had been given a single mandate and an unlimited budget, and a promise that it would never, ever be mentioned in any report that could be intercepted, decoded, or leaked. The office had no name. In the few documents that referenced it at all, it was called the Second Answer, and its purpose was this: to assume that everything the human world showed to the galaxy was known to the galaxy, and to prepare for the day an enemy acted on that knowledge. The office had started from a grim premise. Any advanced species watching Earth could see its shipyards, because shipyards were enormous and hot and impossible to hide. Any watcher could count Earth's fleets, map its defensive stations, catalog its weapons foundries, because all of these things announced themselves. And so, the Second Answer reasoned, an enemy planning a decapitating strike would target exactly these things, the visible teeth, and would build its entire campaign on the confidence that destroying them destroyed humanity's ability to fight. The Second Answer's job was to make that confidence a lie. For 11 years, in total secrecy, humanity had built a second military, not a larger one, a hidden one. Every shipyard the galaxy could see had a shadow the galaxy could not, buried inside hollowed asteroids, submerged beneath the ice crusts of outer moons, tucked into the gravitational blind spots of gas giants, where no sensor could look without being blinded by the world it hid behind. Every weapon foundry that smoked and glowed for any watcher to count had a twin that produced nothing detectable, its output routed through channels designed to look like ordinary commerce. The visible fleet, the 400 ships Admiral Rowe had counted, was real. It was also bait. Ilya spread the folder's contents across the table, and the room went very quiet, because most of the people in it were seeing this for the first time. There are 3,200 warships that the concordance cannot see, she said, because they were never meant to be seen. There are 11 concealed shipyards still producing more. There is a weapons program the visible foundries were specifically designed to distract attention from, and it works, and I have watched it work, and I will tell you in a moment exactly what it does. But first I need you to understand the shape of what's about to happen, because if you understand the shape, you will understand why I walked in here smiling." She looked around the table, at the admirals and the coordinator and the frightened, brilliant people who ran the defense of a species. "The Concordance has spent 40 years watching us," she said, "and everything they watched, we let them watch. They have built their whole campaign on a map of our strength, and the map is a decoy. In 3 days they are going to arrive expecting to strike a child. And they are going to find that the child was never the thing standing in the room. The child was the thing standing in the doorway, so that they wouldn't look at what was behind it." Adiz Okonkwo looked at the spread of documents for a long moment. Then she looked at the young officer who had brought them, and something in her tired face shifted, hardened, became the thing that had held the highest office in human space for 11 years. "Show me," she said, "everything." What Ilya showed them took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it the mood in the war room had changed in a way that no one quite wanted to name aloud, because naming it felt like tempting fate. The fear was still there. But underneath the fear, for the first time since the declaration, there was something with a spine to it. There was a plan that had been 11 years in the making, and the enemy did not know it existed, and that single fact rearranged everything. The architect of the second answer, it turned out, was a woman named Dr. Wenjiang, who had died 4 years earlier and whose funeral had listed her occupation as logistics analyst. Ilya had never met her. But she had inherited Wen's work, in the way a river inherits a spring, and she had spent 6 years studying the enemy that Wen had spent 7 years preparing to defeat, and between the two of them, across a decade and a death, they had built the thing that was now unfolding on the war room table like a flower opening. Dr. Wen's core insight, Ilya said, was that the Concordance's greatest strength is also the exact shape of its greatest weakness. They are certain. They have never lost. In 11,000 years, they have never once had their assessment of an enemy turn out to be wrong. And so they have never developed the one capacity that a species which sometimes loses must develop, which is the habit of doubting itself. They do not check their conclusions because their conclusions have never needed checking. They do not look behind the visible because the visible has always been the whole story. Their confidence is not a feeling. It's a structural feature of how they make decisions. And it means that once they've built a plan on a map, they will execute that plan even if the map is wrong, because they have no mechanism for suspecting that a map could be wrong. "You're describing a species that can't imagine being deceived," said Admiral Rowe slowly. "I'm describing a species that has never needed to imagine it," Ilya corrected, "which is almost the same thing and almost is the entire war." She brought up a new display, and on it the Concordance battle fleet resolved out of the dark, 11,000 vessels arranged in the formation that 4 erasures of archival records showed they always used, a vast disk of overlapping fields and layered escorts with the command hierarchy nested in the center like the yolk of an egg. It was a formation optimized for one thing: delivering an overwhelming decapitating strike against a known set of targets, and then withdrawing before the target could mount any organized response. It was not a formation optimized for a long war, because the Concordance had never fought one. It had never needed to. "They'll translate in here," Ilya said, and marked a region of empty space beyond the orbit of the outermost human colony. "Standard approach. They give the traditional warning again on arrival, which by their charter they must, and then they move on the visible targets. The shipyards at Ceres, Titan, Ganymede, the orbital foundries over Mars, the defensive stations at the Lagrange points, and the main fleet anchorage over Earth itself. Everything they can see. Everything we let them see. Their models say that when those targets are gone, humanity's capacity to make war is gone because their models are built from the map we gave them. And they are correct. When those targets are gone, humanity's visible capacity to make war will be gone." She let that sit. And that, she said, is the moment we've been building toward for 11 years. Because at the instant they believe they've won, they will do the thing they always do at that instant. They'll drop out of strike formation and into withdrawal formation. It's in every record we have of every erasure. The strike formation is aggressive and concentrated and armored on the approach vector. The withdrawal formation is loose and fast and armored on the departure vector, which is the opposite direction. For roughly 9 minutes, according to the archival timings, the Concordance fleet turns its unprotected flank to the very space we've hidden our second military inside. Because they don't know it's there. Because they've already won. Because they are certain. The war room was silent. Even Adiz Okonkwo was silent. 9 minutes, Ilya said. That's the whole war. Everything we've built, everything Dr. Wen died designing, all of it comes down to 9 minutes when the most powerful fleet in the galaxy shows us its back because it cannot conceive of a reason not to. Admiral Rowe leaned on the table with both hands. And in those 9 minutes, we do what exactly? 3,000 ships against 11,000 is better than 400 against 11,000. It is not a victory. It's a bloodier defeat. It would be, Ilya agreed, if the plan were to fight them ship to ship. It isn't. We're not going to fight their fleet, Admiral. We're going to unmake their ability to have a fleet at all. And for that, I need to tell you about the thing the visible foundries were built to hide. The thing was called, in the few documents that dared name it, the lattice. It had begun as a mistake. 9 years earlier, a research program buried inside the second answer had been trying to solve a mundane problem: how to move enormous masses through space without the enormous energy costs of conventional drives. The idea had been to manipulate the local structure of spacetime in a small, controlled way, to make a ship's mass briefly irrelevant so that it could be moved with trivial effort. The program had failed at its intended purpose. It turned out you could not make a ship's mass irrelevant in a way that was survivable for the crew. But in failing, it had discovered something else. The technique that could not safely reduce a mass could, with terrible ease, do the opposite. It could reach into the structure of matter at a distance and introduce a specific kind of disorder, a cascading failure of the bonds that held complex machinery together. It did not explode things. It did something quieter and far worse. It made things stop being the things they were. A drive core subjected to the lattice did not detonate. It simply ceased to be a drive core, its internal structure unwinding into inert, meaningless mass in the space of a few seconds. A weapon subjected to the lattice became a sculpture of a weapon, perfect on the outside, dead all the way through. It had two crucial properties. The first was range. It could be projected across the distances of a fleet engagement, which no conventional weapon could do with any precision. The second, and the one that had made Dr. Wen weep when she understood it, according to the notes Ilya had inherited, was selectivity. The lattice could be tuned. It could be told what kinds of structures to unmake and what kinds to leave alone. It could be told to unmake drive cores and weapon systems and the specific gravitic architectures the Concordance used, and to pass harmlessly through hulls, through life support, through the compartments where living things were. It doesn't kill, Ilya said, and her voice was very quiet now, and everyone in the room was leaning in to hear it. That was Dr. Wen's requirement, and she was inflexible about it, and I've kept faith with it because I think she was right, and not only for the reasons she wrote down. The lattice can be built to slaughter. She refused to build it that way. What it does instead is disarm. It reaches across a battle, and it unmakes the enemy's capacity to fight, their drives, their weapons, their shields, and it leaves the ships intact, and it leaves the crews alive, drifting, powerless in vessels that are suddenly nothing but sealed metal rooms full of people who can no longer hurt anyone. She looked around the table. The Concordance declared war on our capacity to make war, she said. They told us in their own words that they would remove our teeth in a single stroke and leave us alive as a lesson. So here is the shape of the thing. In 3 days, we are going to do to them exactly what they came here to do to us. We are going to remove their teeth, all of them. Every drive, every gun, every yard, every foundry that makes their weapons of war, unmade in a single stroke, across their entire battle fleet in the 9 minutes when they show us their back. And we are going to leave them alive. 11,000 ships full of living crews, drifting, harmless, powerless in the dark above our world. And they are going to understand all at once that everything they were certain of was wrong. The silence in the room had a texture now. They came to teach us a lesson, Ilya said. We're going to let them. Just not the one they planned. It was Admiral Rowe who asked the hard question, because he was the kind of man who always asked the hard question, and because he had learned in a long career that the plans which sounded most beautiful in a war room were the ones that most needed someone to poke at their soft places. You said the lattice has range, he said. You said it can reach across a fleet engagement, but the Concordance battle fleet is 11,000 ships spread across a volume of space larger than several planetary orbits. No single projector reaches that far. How many projectors do you have? And where are they? And what happens if the timing is off by more than your 9 minutes? Ilya nodded slowly, because it was exactly the right question, and because she had lain awake over it more nights than she could count. We have 411 lattice projectors, she said, built over 9 years, one at a time, each one hidden inside a hollowed asteroid or an ice moon or the shadow of a gas giant, positioned across the entire volume the Concordance approach vector passes through. Not one of them is a ship. They don't move, they don't emit, they look like rock and ice and nothing, and every one of them has been in position, cold and silent and waiting for years. Together, their fields overlap. Together, they cover the entire engagement volume. And they fire not on a signal from any single command, because a single command can be intercepted or destroyed or jammed, but on a distributed trigger, 411 separate systems all watching for the same thing. The moment the Concordance fleet drops from strike formation into withdrawal formation, the moment they turn their backs, each projector knows the signature of that transition. When enough of them see it at once, they all fire together, automatically in the same instant, without waiting for a human voice to give the order. Because in 9 minutes, there's no time for a human voice. Distributed autonomy, Rowe murmured. So there's no command node for them to destroy. There's no command node for them to even find, Ilya said. That was Dr. Wen's design. She built a weapon with no head to cut off. She built it out of patience. 411 pieces of patience, buried in rock, waiting 11 years for 9 minutes. Adiz Okonkwo spoke then, for the first time in a long while, and her voice was careful. And if you are wrong, she said, if they do not drop their formation, if 40 years of archival record is a coincidence and this time they withdraw and strike formation, armored the whole way, if the trigger never fires, what then? Then the projectors don't fire, Ilya said simply. They don't reveal themselves. They stay cold and hidden, and the Concordance destroys our visible fleet and our visible yards exactly as they planned, and they leave believing they've won, never knowing we were ever more than they thought. And we begin again, from the shadows, with 3,000 hidden ships and 11 secret yards, and the knowledge that our real strength was never found. That's the beauty of a decoy coordinator. If it works, we win. If it fails, we've lost nothing we weren't already going to lose, and we've kept a secret that buys us the future. Dr. Wen built a plan that cannot make our situation worse. It can only make it better, or leave it exactly as bad as it already is. Okonkwo studied her for a long moment. You're very certain, she said, for someone so young. No, coordinator, Ilya said. I'm the opposite of certain. That's the whole point. Certainty is the enemy's disease. I've built a plan that works whether I'm right or wrong, precisely because I don't trust myself to be right. The Concordance would never build a plan like this because they've never once needed to plan for being wrong. That's the difference between us and them. That's the only difference that matters. And in 3 days, it's going to be the difference between a garden and a graveyard, and I intend for it to be their graveyard, filled with living things they can't kill and can't use and can't ever be certain of again. They gave her the war. Not formally, not all at once, but over the hours that followed, the war room slowly reorganized itself around the plan Ilya had brought, the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet. Adiz Okonkwo made the decision that had to be made, which was that the visible defense would continue exactly as if the second answer did not exist. The 400 ships of the visible fleet would mass over Earth. The visible yards would go to full battle readiness. Every observable thing humanity did would tell the watching concordance a single consistent story. A frightened child, marshaling its pitiful strength for a hopeless stand. Because the watchers were the danger now. Ilya was certain the concordance had eyes in the human systems. Sensor platforms and passive listeners salted through the dark over decades, and every one of them had to see the decoy, and only the decoy. If a single hidden yard lit up, if a single lattice projector so much as warmed, if a single officer in a single unsecured channel spoke the word lattice aloud, the whole 11-year edifice could collapse, because a species that saw the trap could refuse to spring it. So the true plan lived in silence. The 3,000 hidden ships stayed hidden. The 411 projectors stayed cold. And a very small number of people, of whom Ilya Sorensen was now inexplicably one of the most important, moved through the underground beneath the Urals, speaking in the low voices of conspirators, coordinating an operation that most of humanity would never know had happened, against an enemy that must never know it existed until the instant it was already unmade. Ilya slept 4 hours in the first 30. She spent the rest at a console, running and rerunning the projection, not because she doubted the plan, but because doubting the plan was the plan, checking the timings, modeling the ways the concordance might deviate from its ancient pattern, building contingencies inside contingencies. She thought about her grandmother's chessboard. The most dangerous move is the one your opponent is certain you cannot make. She thought about Dr. Wen, whom she had never met, building patience out of rock for 7 years, and then dying before she could see whether it worked. She thought about the 11,000 ships full of living crews who were, at this moment, crossing the dark toward her world in perfect confidence, certain of victory, certain of themselves, certain of a map that a dead woman had spent her life turning into a lie. And she thought, in the small hours when the console light was the only light, about what it would do to a mind that had never once been wrong to discover, all at once and past any hope of remedy, exactly how wrong it had always been. She was almost sorry for them. Almost. Aboard the flagship of the Concordance battle fleet, in the crystalline chamber that served as its command sanctum, the suzerain of the Harvek watched the small blue world grow slowly larger in its field of perception, and felt something it had not felt in a very long time. It took the suzerain some moments to identify the feeling, because it was so unfamiliar, and when it did identify it, it dismissed it as impossible and thought no more of it. The feeling had been unease. The suzerain was old even by the standards of the Harvek, who measured their lives in the slow accretion of crystalline thought across millennia. It had presided over 4 erasures. It had watched 4 young and arrogant species learn, in their final hours, the difference between believing themselves important and being important, and it had felt, each time, the clean satisfaction of a gardener pulling a weed before it could choke the flowers. This would be the 5th. It should have felt like the others. Instead, as the human world grew in its sight, the suzerain found itself returning, again and again, to a single detail in the assessor's report, a detail it had noted and dismissed, and now found itself unable to fully release. The human growth curve was exponential. Every species the concordance had erased had grown linearly, the way civilizations grew, each generation building modestly on the last. But the humans grew differently. They compounded. They took every advance and immediately turned it into the foundation for the next, and the curve of their capability bent upward in a way the suzerain's long crystalline mind found, if it was honest with itself, faintly disturbing to contemplate. Uralvanti soon had said it plainly in the drowned amphitheater. The only variable that changes the outcome is time. Act now, while they are children and the cost is trivial. Wait, and the cost is everything. They were acting now. The children were 3 days from erasure. The cost would be trivial. The suzerain told itself these things, and they were true. And still the unease did not entirely leave. And the suzerain did not understand why. And because it did not understand why, and because in 11,000 years it had never once been given cause to distrust its own understanding, it decided the unease meant nothing, and it let the matter go. This was the moment. Though the suzerain would not know it for another 3 days, this was the exact moment the war was lost. The moment an ancient and undefeated mind felt the faint, correct whisper of danger, and having no habit of doubt, mistook it for nothing. "Signal the fleet," the suzerain said to the crystalline attendants who nested around it like frost. "We translate to the target system in 2 of their days. Prepare the traditional warning. Let it never be said the concordance struck without honor." The attendants chimed their assent, and 11,000 ships full of confident crews sailed on toward a blue world that was watching them come, and counting. On the second day, the concordance eyes in the human system saw exactly what humanity wanted them to see, and reported it faithfully home. They saw the visible fleet gathering, 411 vessels, and the suzerain's analysts noted the coincidence of the number with something in the archives and could not place it and set it aside, massing in a defensive sphere over the human homeworld. They saw the visible yards at Ceres and Titan and Ganymede running hot, flinging out the last hurried warships their production lines could manage, a desperate final surge of a species that knew it was too little and too late. They saw the orbital foundries over Mars glowing with the light of round-the-clock weapons production. They saw the defensive stations at the gravitational balance points powering up their fields. They saw, in short, a child emptying its pockets of every stone it owned, arranging them into a wall, and standing behind the wall with its small fists clenched. The concordance analysts fed all of this into their models, and the models produced a number, and the number was 0.003. That was the probability, according to 40 years of observation and 11,000 years of method, that the human defense would inflict any meaningful damage on the concordance battle fleet before it was annihilated. The suzerain reviewed the number and found it satisfactory and adjusted the strike plan not at all, because there was nothing to adjust. The targets were exactly where the map said they would be. The child had brought all its stones into the light, and now the concordance would sweep them away, and the garden would be tended, and the lesson would be taught. Not one of the concordance's 40 years of watchers had ever seen a lattice projector, because there was nothing to see. Not one of them had detected a single hidden ship, because the hidden ships emitted nothing. Not one of them had ever heard the word lattice, because it had never been spoken aloud on any channel a watcher could reach. The map the concordance carried into battle was complete, and consistent, and confidently wrong. And it was wrong in the one way that a species incapable of doubt could never check. Deep beneath the ice of a moon in the outer human system, one of 411 cold and silent things adjusted, by a fraction, the orientation of a field it had held ready for 6 years, and went on waiting. Ilya Sorensen watched the concordance fleet translate into the outer system at 06:44 on the 3rd day, and her hands did not shake, and she was faintly surprised by that. She stood in the underground war room beside Adiz Okonkwo and Admiral Rowe, and on the great central display, the 11,000 ships of the concordance battle fleet bloomed out of the dark in their perfect disk, layer upon layer of overlapping fields. The command hierarchy nested in the glowing center like the yolk of an egg, exactly as 40 years of archival record had promised. Ilya felt a strange calm settle over her as she watched them arrange themselves, because everything they did, every maneuver, every formation adjustment, matched the projection she had run 900 times. They were not deviating. They were doing exactly what they always did, because they had never once had a reason not to, and that unbroken habit was the rope they were about to hang themselves with. Strike formation confirmed, a technician called out. They're holding at the edge of the outer system, transmitting. The traditional warning arrived, and Okonkwo ordered it played, because there was no reason not to, and the drowned voice of the suzerain filled the war room one final time. Let it be known to the species called human that the hour of judgment has come. You have had your 3 days. Compose yourselves. The concordance of 9 acts now to remove your capacity to trouble the garden of the galaxy, that you may live on harmless as a lesson to all who would grow wrong. We take no joy in this. We take no worlds and no lives beyond what the removal of your weapons requires. Know that we are just. Know that we are certain. It is done. Ilya listened to the whole of it, and when it ended she said, very quietly, so that only Okonkwo and Ro could hear her, "They just described our plan, word for word. They just told us exactly what we're about to do to them. They can't even imagine that the words could point in the other direction." "Don't," Ro murmured. "Not yet, not until it's done. Watch." She watched. The Concordance fleet began its approach, and it came exactly as the archives said it would come, the great disk sliding inward through the human system on a vector that took it, obligingly, through the very volume of space, where 411 cold things waited buried in rock and ice. The fleet did not scan that volume with any special attention, because there was nothing in the map to make it worth scanning. It slid past hollowed asteroids that were not asteroids and ice moons that hid more than ice, and it noticed none of them, and the projectors held their fields and stayed cold, and let the enemy pass into the center of the web. "There in the envelope," a technician said, her voice tight. "All 411 projectors report the fleet is within engagement range. Trigger conditions not yet met, waiting on formation shift." "They have to strike first," Ilya said, half to herself, half to the room. "The trigger doesn't fire until they drop to withdrawal formation, and they don't drop to withdrawal formation until they think they've won. So we have to let them win first. We have to let them destroy everything they can see, and we have to stand here and watch it happen, and we cannot fire until they turn their backs, because if we fire while they're still in strike formation, the whole thing fails. Everyone in this room needs to understand that. In the next 10 minutes, we are going to watch our visible fleet die, and we are not going to do anything about it, because that is the plan, and the plan only works if we have the discipline to lose first." The room understood. The room did not like it. The room watched. The Concordance struck the way a wave strikes a sandcastle, all at once and without malice, and it was, Ilya would remember for the rest of her life, terrible to watch even knowing it was necessary. The great disk of the battle fleet unfolded its weapons across the human system, and the gravitic lances the Concordance used, weapons that reached across space and simply crushed their targets in fists of folded gravity, began their work. The visible fleet over Earth, 411 ships, died in 90 seconds. They fought. That was the thing Ilya had not been ready for, even though she had planned it, even though she had known the visible fleet was bait. The crews of those ships had not been told they were bait. They could not be told because the secret could not risk it. They fought with everything they had, and they died believing they were the last defense of their species. And Ilya stood in the war room and watched them die and knew that they had bought the real plan its concealment with their lives and their ignorance. And she made herself watch every second of it, because it was the least she owed them. The yards went next. Ceres, Titan, Ganymede, the great orbital foundries over Mars, the constructions of decades unmade in minutes by weapons that folded them into points and let them go. The defensive stations at the balance points flared and failed. The Concordance moved through the human system with the unhurried thoroughness of a gardener pulling weeds, target after target after target, everything the map showed, everything humanity had let them see. And in the underground beneath the Urals, 40 of the most senior officers of the Terran Coordinated Command stood in silence and watched their visible strength annihilated and did not fire, did not so much as warm a projector, because the trap only worked if the enemy believed it had already sprung its own. Last visible target, a technician said. Her voice was shaking now. The main anchorage over Earth, they're engaging, it's gone, all visible targets destroyed. The Concordance fleet is holding position over the homeworld. This is it, Ilya breathed. This is the moment, watch the formation, watch it. For a span of seconds that felt like hours, the Concordance fleet held its strike disk over the ruined orbital space of the human homeworld, its weapons cooling, its work complete. And then, exactly as 40 years of archival record had promised, exactly as Dr. Wen had staked 7 years and her whole life upon, exactly as Ilya had run 900 times in the small hours at her console, the great disk began to loosen. The command hierarchy uncoiled from its protected center. The armored strike faces relaxed. The fleet began the transition it always began at the moment it believed it had won, the shift from the concentrated aggression of the strike to the loose, fast, forward armored geometry of the withdrawal, turning its unprotected flank to the empty-seeming dark it had passed through, presenting its back to 411 cold and patient things. Formation shift detected, a technician said, and her voice cracked. Projector network reports trigger conditions met, all 411 projectors confirm, they're arming, autonomous, no command required. Ilya Sorensen did not give an order, because there was no order to give. The plan had taken the decision out of human hands precisely so that it could not fail through hesitation or interception, and there was a mercy in that, because she was not certain, in that instant, that her voice would have worked. She stood very still beside the first coordinator of human space and watched the display and thought, with sudden and total clarity, of her grandmother's board, and of the move the opponent is certain you cannot make, and of the thing that happens to a mind when that move appears. 9 minutes, she whispered. Let's see what you're certain of now. The projectors fired. There was no flash. That was the first thing anyone who witnessed it remarked upon afterward, the ones who saw the sensor feeds, and the ones aboard the surviving human observation platforms that had been positioned, at great risk, to record the moment. There was no explosion, no beam, no visible weapon at all. There was only a change in the quality of the space around the Concordance fleet. A subtle shimmer in the sensor returns, as though the dark itself had drawn a breath. And then, across a volume larger than several planetary orbits, 11,000 ships stopped being warships. The lattice reached into them all at once, 411 overlapping fields folding together into a single instant of tuned, selective unmaking. It found the drive cores and unwound them. It found the gravitic lances that had crushed the human fleet and turned their delicate internal architectures to inert and meaningless mass. It found the shield generators, the targeting systems, the great gravitic engines that let the Concordance fold space, the weapons foundries aboard the tender ships, the whole vast apparatus by which 11,000 vessels made and projected war, and it unmade all of it, drive by drive and gun by gun, in the space of a few seconds, and it passed through everything else, through the hulls, through the life support, through the crystalline chambers and the pressurized compartments where living things were. And it left them untouched. 11,000 ships went dark in the same breath. Not destroyed. That was the thing the Concordance would take longest to understand, and the thing that would break something in it that had never broken before. The ships were not destroyed. They were disarmed, every drive stilled, every gun a sculpture of a gun, perfect on the outside and dead all the way through, every shield gone. The great battle fleet that had crossed the dark to erase a species hung suddenly motionless above that species' homeworld, powerless, weaponless, drifting, 11,000 sealed metal rooms full of living crews who could no longer hurt anyone at all. In the crystalline command sanctum of the flagship, the suzerain of the Harvek felt the drive core of its own vessel cease to exist. It did not understand at first. Its long crystalline mind, which had never in 11,000 years encountered a fact it could not immediately place, reached for an explanation and found none. A malfunction. That was the first hypothesis, and it lasted less than a second, because a malfunction did not silence 11,000 drives in the same instant. A weapon, then. But there had been no weapon, no strike, nothing on any sensor, and besides, the humans had no weapon that could do this. The map was clear. The map was complete. The map said the humans were a child with 400 ships and a wall of stones. The suzerain reached for the map it had carried across the dark, the map on which it had built the entire architecture of this campaign and 4 campaigns before it, and it found, for the first time in its immensely long existence, that the map did not describe the world. And then the human transmission arrived, on every concordance channel at once, and the suzerain understood everything all at once, past any hope of remedy, exactly as Ilya Sorensen had known it would. The transmission had been recorded in advance, and it had been recorded in the low chiming speech of the concordance itself, and the voice that carried it was not Ilya's, because Ilya had insisted on that. The voice belonged to a Des Okonkwo, first coordinator of human space, because if this was to be a lesson, it should be taught by the highest authority a species possessed, the way the suzerain had presumed to teach. To the concordance of 9, the transmission began. You declared war upon our capacity to make war. You told us in your own words that you would remove our teeth in a single stroke and leave us alive, harmless, as a lesson to all who would grow wrong. We have listened carefully to everything you said, and so, in the language you chose, by the logic you chose, we return your judgment to you. Your fleet is disarmed. Every drive, every weapon, every yard and foundry you carried into our system to make war upon us, unmade. We have not killed your crews. We have not taken your ships or your lives or anything beyond what the removal of your weapons required. We have been, in your own word, just. Look out at the dark around you and count. 11,000 vessels, not one of them destroyed, not one of them able to fire. This is what it looks like when your teeth are pulled. We wanted you to see it clearly because we suspect you have never seen it before. You believed you were certain. You built your campaign on a map of our strength, and you never once suspected the map could be a lie, because in 11,000 years you have never needed to suspect it. That was not strength. That was the absence of a habit. We are a young species, and we lose, and we have lost, and losing taught us the one thing you never learned, which is to doubt ourselves, to check our conclusions, to look behind the visible for the thing that might be hiding there. We looked behind our own visible strength and hid our real strength inside the shadow, and we assumed you would do the same to us, and you did not, because you did not know how. You are not destroyed. Your crews are alive. Your drives can be repaired in time in your own yards far from here. We will permit you to be recovered by your own people and to withdraw and to carry home the memory of this day. We ask nothing of you. We demand no tribute, no territory, no surrender. We want only that you understand what has happened here, and that you carry that understanding back to the drowned amphitheater beneath your moon city, and that you speak it plainly to the 9. Tell them a child stood in the doorway so you would not look behind it. Tell them the garden they came to tend was watching them the whole time and counting. And tell them that humanity does not wish to be your enemy, but that we will no longer permit ourselves to be your weed. We know now that you can be surprised. We suspect you did not know it yourselves until today. We hope the knowledge serves you better than your certainty did. You gave us 3 days to compose ourselves. It took us 3 hours. Compose yourselves. The transmission ended. And in 11,000 silent, drifting ships, the crews of the Concordance of Nine sat in the dark and understood all at once that everything they had been certain of was wrong, and that the thing they had come to erase had spared them, and that the sparing was itself the deepest wound of all, because it meant they had been, from the first moment, entirely in the power of a species they had called a child, and had never known it. In the command sanctum of the flagship, the suzerain of the Harvek did the thing its species almost never did. It reviewed its own reasoning, step by step, searching for the error, and it found the error, and the error was not a fact it had gotten wrong. The error was the shape of its own thinking. It had built a plan on certainty, and it had never checked the certainty, because the certainty had never before required checking, and a mind that cannot check its certainty cannot defend itself against a mind that has learned to check everything. The suzerain thought of the unease it had felt on the approach, the faint, correct whisper of danger it had dismissed because it had no habit of doubt. The whisper had been right. The suzerain had had in its grasp the single thread that could have unraveled the whole human plan, and it had let the thread go, because in 11,000 years nothing had ever taught it to hold on. That, the suzerain understood now, was what the humans meant. That was the lesson, not the disarming, terrible as it was. The lesson was that the Concordance's greatest strength, its perfect unbroken confidence, had been the exact shape of the blade the humans had used to gut it, and that the humans had known this, had built their entire war upon it, had staked everything on the certainty that the certain do not check. They had been correct. The suzerain became aware that its attendants were waiting, nested around it like frost, for it to speak, to give an order, to do the thing a commander does. But there was no order to give. The fleet could not fire. It could not move. It could not fold space to flee. It could only drift and wait to be recovered by its own distant people, and carry home the memory of the day the garden had turned out to be tending itself. "Signal the fleet," the suzerain said at last, and its crystalline voice, which had presided over 4 erasures without a tremor, was not entirely steady now. "Cease all attempts to restore weapons and drives. They will not restore. Preserve life support. Await recovery." It paused, and then it said the thing it had never once said in 11,000 years, the thing its species had no ready words for, so that the translation into the human tongue would come out strange and formal and true. And record for the Nine that the assessor was correct. The humans were the greatest threat the Concordance has ever faced, and we did not fail to defeat them because we came too late. We failed because we came at all certain of a thing we had never learned to doubt. Record that, word for word. Let it never be softened. The attendants chimed their assent, and it was a broken sort of chiming, and the flagship of the Concordance of Nine drifted powerless above the blue world it had come to erase, and waited in the dark for its people to come and carry it home. In the underground war room beneath the Urals, no one cheered. Ilya had thought, in the long nights of preparation, that if the plan worked there would be some eruption of joy, some release of the terror that had lived in every human heart for 3 days. But when it came, when the display showed 11,000 ships gone dark and drifting, and the transmission finished playing, and the impossible thing had happened exactly as she had built it to happen, the war room was silent. The silence was not the silence of disappointment. It was the silence of people who had walked to the very edge of the extinction of their species, and had been spared, and did not yet have the strength to feel anything about it except the vast and hollow relief of still being alive. It was Admiral Rowe who broke it. He was standing beside Ilya, and he looked at the display, at the powerless armada hanging harmless above the homeworld, at the 411 cold things that had waited 11 years for 9 minutes, and then done in seconds what 400 ships full of the dead had bought with their lives. And he let out a long breath, and he said quietly, "Dr. Wen should have seen this." "She did," Ilya said, "every part of it. She saw it 7 years ago in a room like this one, when it was just a curve on a chart and a weapon she refused to build the way it wanted to be built. She just didn't get to watch. That's the part she doesn't get, the watching." She was quiet for a moment. "Somebody should write down that she built it, Not the logistics analyst thing. The real thing. Somebody should write it down somewhere it can't be intercepted, so that in 100 years a human being can read it and know who she was. You'll write it, Rose said. You knew her work better than anyone alive. You finished it. You write it. Ilya nodded slowly and did not answer, because she was watching the display, watching the great powerless fleet begin, ship by ship, the long, slow business of signaling its distant home for recovery, and she was thinking about what would come next, because the officer in her never stopped thinking about what would come next. The 3 days between the declaration and the arrival were, for the small circle of people who knew the truth, the longest of their lives, and for humanity at large they were something stranger and harder to describe. Because humanity at large did not know about the second answer. Humanity at large knew only what the concordance had broadcast, the drowned voice telling an entire species to compose itself and make peace with its gods, and humanity at large had responded to that news the way any people responds to the announcement of its own execution. There was panic in the early hours, on some worlds worse than others. There were those who took to the streets, and those who took to their homes, and those who simply sat and stared at the sky and waited. There were religious revivals, and there were riots, and there were, on the colony at Ceres, in the shadow of a shipyard that would be dead within 3 days, a series of quiet, unremarkable acts of ordinary human decency. People helping strangers, people forgiving debts, people saying the things they had always meant to say to the people they had always meant to say them to, because it seemed that the time for saying them had run out. Ilya thought about this a great deal in the underground beneath the Urals, in the hours she was not at her console. She thought about the fact that billions of human beings were, at that moment, living through the end of the world, and that she could not tell them it was not the end, because telling them would tell the Watchers, and telling the Watchers would make it the end for real. The cruelest part of the plan, the part Dr. Wen had understood and accepted, and that Ilya now had to carry, was that the terror had to be genuine. The panic had to be real. Every frightened human being on every human world was, without knowing it, part of the decoy, and their fear was the most convincing element of it, because fear could not be faked at that scale, and the Concordance's Watchers would see the fear, and believe the thing the fear implied, which was that humanity had no hope and knew it. They're carrying it too, Ilya said to Admiral Rowe, late on the second night when neither of them could sleep. Every person out there who's scared right now, they're carrying the plan and they don't even know it. Their fear is doing more to sell the decoy than anything we built, and we can't ever tell them. Most of them will go their whole lives thinking we got lucky, or that the Concordance changed its mind, or that some miracle saved us. They'll never know they were the miracle. They'll never know their terror was the thing that made it work. Rowe was quiet for a while. Does that bother you? Yes, Ilya said. It bothers me every hour, but it's the price. Dr. Wen understood that too. She wrote about it. She said a hidden defense only protects the people it can never tell. She said that was the loneliest thing about the work, that you save everyone and you can never let them thank you, because the thanks would give you away. Ilya was quiet a moment. I used to think that was just a hard truth she'd made her peace with. Now I think it might be the whole point. The Concordance takes credit for everything it does. It announces its judgments in a drowned amphitheater and broadcasts them to the target so that everyone knows the garden was tended. It needs to be seen. That's its vanity, and its vanity is a kind of blindness. Dr. Wen built a defense that needs to never be seen. That's the opposite of vanity, and it's the reason it works. We beat them because we were willing to save the world in secret and let the world never know. There was one more thing that happened in those 3 days that Ilya would carry with her afterward, and it happened on the second day, in a corridor of the underground complex, and it involved a young technician named Pavel Antonov who worked the projector network monitoring station, and who could not, know what the projector network was. He knew only that he monitored 411 distributed sensor packages scattered across the outer system, that they had been there for years, and that his job was to confirm they remained cold and dark and undetected. He did not know they were weapons. He had been told they were passive early warning stations, and he had believed it, because there was no reason not to, and because the truth was above his clearance by a distance that would have made him laugh if he had known it. Ilya found him in the corridor on the second day, and he was frightened, the way everyone was frightened, and he stopped her because she was an officer and he needed to say a thing to someone. "Commander," he said, "the warning stations, my stations, is there any point? If they're coming, if there's nothing we can do, is there any point in me sitting there watching a bunch of cold sensors that can't do anything but tell us we're about to die a few seconds sooner?" And Ilya, who could not tell him the truth, who could never tell him that his cold sensors were the 411 pieces of patience that were about to save his species, looked at this frightened young man and understood that she had to give him something, and that whatever she gave him could not be the truth, and that it still had to be enough to get him back to his station. "Yes," she said, "there's a point. I can't tell you what it is. I need you to hear that, and I need you to trust it. I know that's an enormous thing to ask of a person on a day like this. But your stations matter more than almost anything else in this entire facility, and the reason you can't see how is the whole reason they matter. Go back and watch them. Keep them cold. Report every reading exactly on time. And when this is over, if it goes the way I think it might, I promise you that one day, maybe years from now, someone will tell you what you did. It won't be me, but someone will. Go watch your stations, Pavel, please." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in her certainty, which was not certainty at all but the careful performance of a person who had built a plan precisely so she would not have to be certain, reached him. He nodded. He went back to his station. And on the third day, when 411 cold things woke in the same instant, and did in seconds what 400 ships full of the dead had bought with their lives, Pavel Antonov watched his readings spike and had no idea at all, that he was watching his species survive. Ilya kept her promise, years later. But that came after, and it came quietly, and it is not part of this story except to say that she was the kind of person who kept that kind of promise, and that this, more than her cleverness, more than her grandmother's chessboard, more than the 6 years she had spent studying an enemy that thought it could not be surprised, was the thing that made her the right person to have been standing at that console on that day. There was a question that haunted the small circle in the days after the victory, and it was Okonkwo who finally asked it aloud, in a private room, with only Ro and Ilya present. "What do we become?" the first coordinator said, "now that we know we can do this? A species that can disarm the greatest fleet in the galaxy without firing a visible shot and choose to spare it and have that choice be the most terrifying thing about us. That is enormous power. Power like that changes the people who hold it. I have watched it change smaller people over smaller things. What do we do so that it doesn't change us into something like them? Something certain. Something that gardens." Ilya thought about it for a long time before she answered, because it deserved a long time. "I think," she said finally, "we keep doing the one thing they never could. We keep doubting ourselves. The lattice isn't what makes us safe, coordinator. Doubt is what makes us safe. The moment we become certain, the moment we decide we're the gardeners now and the galaxy is our garden, we become exactly the thing we just defeated, and we become vulnerable in exactly the way we just proved is fatal, because somewhere out there, someday, there'll be a younger species that we've dismissed as a child, standing in a doorway, and behind it 11 years of silence. The only defense against being surprised is to never stop assuming you can be. The Concordants forgot that, if they ever knew it. We just learned it. The work from here on is not to forget it either. That's harder than building a weapon. Weapons are easy. Staying humble after you've won is the hard part, and it's the only part that matters, and it's the whole reason we're still alive to have this conversation." Okonkwo studied the young officer for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly and she said, "Then that goes in the record too, at the front, before everything else. so that whoever leads this species in 100 years reads it before they read a single word about the lattice. She paused. You'll write that part first. Yes, coordinator, Ilya said, and she did. She wrote it that same night, alone at her console in the underground quiet, with the great display finally dark. She wrote that a species is never in more danger than in the hour after it wins, because winning is the fastest way a people has ever found to stop asking whether it might be wrong. She wrote that the Concordance had been the strongest civilization in the galaxy, and had lost to a child in an afternoon for exactly that reason and no other. And she wrote, last of all, that the day humanity forgot to be afraid of its own certainty was the day it would deserve to lose everything it had just fought to keep, and that she hoped whoever read those words in some distant century would find that the warning had proven unnecessary, and would smile at the worry of a young officer long dead, and would go on doubting humbly, watchfully, forever, in the quiet human way that had once, against every projection, saved the world. Because the war was won, but the winning of it had only changed the question, and Ilya Sorensen had spent 6 years learning to see the question after the question. The Concordance would recover its fleet. That had been built into the plan from the start, and it had been Dr. Wen's most controversial decision, argued over for years in the small hidden councils of the second answer. There had been voices, serious and not unreasonable voices, that had said the only safe course was to destroy the fleet outright, to end 11,000 ships and their crews and remove forever the threat they represented. Dr. Wen had refused, and Ilya had kept faith with the refusal, and now, watching the powerless armada drift, Ilya understood in her bones why the dead woman had been right. A destroyed fleet made martyrs. A destroyed fleet gave the Concordance a wound it could nurse into eternal war, a grievance that would harden the Nine against humanity for 10,000 years and guarantee that the next fleet, and the one after, would come with doubt already learned and traps already anticipated. But a spared fleet, a fleet disarmed and drifting and helpless, and then let go, unharmed, to carry home the memory of its own total helplessness. That was something the Concordance had no defense against at all. It was not a grievance. It was a lesson, and the Nine would have to sit with it in the drowned amphitheater, and there would be no dead to avenge, and no atrocity to point to, and no story they could tell themselves except the true one, which was that they had declared war on a species they did not understand, and had been, from the first moment, entirely in that species' power. You could go to war over an injury. It was much harder to go to war over a mercy that had exposed you as a fool. They'll never come back, Ilya said quietly, and Ro glanced at her. Not the way they came, they can't. We've made it impossible. The next time the Nine convene about humanity, someone in that amphitheater is going to remember today, and they're going to have to say aloud the thing they've never had to say in 11,000 years, which is that maybe they're wrong. Maybe the map is a lie. Maybe the child is standing in the doorway again, and a Concordance that has to ask that question isn't the Concordance anymore. We didn't just win a battle, Admiral. We reached into the thing that made them what they are, the certainty, and we broke it, and it doesn't grow back. That was Dr. Wen's real weapon. The lattice was just how she delivered it. Adiz Okonkwo had come to stand beside them, and she had heard the last of it, and she looked at the young officer she had let speak 3 days ago on nothing but the strength of an argument, and she said, "You understood that from the beginning, that the real target wasn't the fleet." "The real target was never the fleet," Ilya said. "The fleet was just the teeth. The real target was the confidence behind the teeth. They came to disarm us in a single stroke and leave us alive as a lesson to everyone watching. So we disarmed them in a single stroke and left them alive as a lesson to everyone watching. Same weapon, same logic. We just aimed it back the way it came. And the lesson the galaxy learns today isn't that humanity is powerful. Powerful species get erased. That's what the Concordance does. The lesson is that humanity can't be surprised because we've already assumed we can be. That's a much more frightening thing to be, out here in the dark. It's the one thing the concordance could never be, and now everyone knows we are. The war room around them was beginning, slowly, to come back to life. The technicians and officers turning from the display to the enormous work that follows any battle, the accounting of what remained and the planning of what came next. But for a moment the three of them stood apart from it. The old admiral and the highest authority in human space, and the young officer who had walked in 3 days ago with a folder she was not supposed to have. And they watched the powerless armada drift above the world it had come to erase. It took the concordance 11 days to recover its fleet. Recovery ships came from the nearest concordance system, slow tender vessels with the tools to tow 11,000 drifting hulks back across the dark, and humanity let them come and did not fire and did not gloat and did not interfere. That had been Okonkwo's decision, and Ilya had agreed with it entirely. The lesson was complete. Anything more would have diluted it, would have turned the clean and terrible fact of what humanity had done into something smaller and pettier, a victor's cruelty, rather than a demonstration of what the victor was capable of and had chosen not to do. So the humans watched the tender ships arrive and attach their tow fields to the powerless hulls, and they let the concordance haul its shame home in silence. The suzerain of the Harvek transmitted a single message to the human worlds before the flagship was towed beyond range. It was brief, and it was in the human tongue, and it had clearly cost the ancient crystalline mind something to compose. It said only this: "The concordance of 9 acknowledges the species called human. We came to teach a lesson. We have learned one. It will be recorded in full in the amphitheater beneath Ves, and it will not be softened, and it will not be forgotten. You will not see us again in the manner we came. This is not a threat. It is the opposite of a threat, and we have no word for the opposite of a threat because we have never before had cause to send one. Understand it as you will. The garden acknowledges that it is not the only thing that tends." And then the flagship of the concordance of 9 was drawn down into the dark, powerless, its crew alive, its certainty gone, and it did not come back. The full history of the second answer was never made public, because a weapon that works by being unknown does not survive being known, and humanity understood now, better than ever, the value of the thing hidden behind the visible. The 411 lattice projectors went cold again and stayed hidden. The 3,000 ships that had never fired a shot returned to their concealment. The visible fleet was rebuilt, and the visible yards, and any watcher who came in the years that followed would see exactly what humanity intended it to see. A young species, growing, no more and no less than it appeared to be. But the story of it was written down, once, in a single document held in a place that could not be intercepted, and Ilya Sorensen wrote it, because Admiral Rowe had been right that she should. She wrote the true account of Dr. Wenjiang, who had understood 7 years before anyone else that the concordance's certainty was its throat, and who had spent her life building a weapon that reached for that throat, and who had insisted, against serious and reasonable opposition, that it be built to disarm and not to kill, because she had understood that a species which spares its enemies teaches a lesson that a species which destroys them never can. Ilya wrote that Dr. Wen had died 4 years before the day her work saved humanity, listed on her death record as a logistics analyst, and that this was the most successful deception of a career built entirely out of successful deceptions, and that she should be remembered as what she was, which was the architect of the day the galaxy learned to fear the species it had called a child. And Ilya wrote, at the end, the thing her grandmother had taught her when she was 7 years old, on a board with pieces you moved with your hands, because it was the truest thing she knew, and because it belonged in the record more than anything else. The most dangerous move on the board is the one your opponent is certain you cannot make, not because it is powerful, because he has built his whole plan on the certainty that it does not exist, and when it appears, he does not merely lose a piece. He loses his understanding of the game. The Concordance of Nine had convened in a drowned amphitheater and declared war on humanity, certain of an easy conquest, certain of a map, certain of themselves. They had given a child 3 days to compose itself and make peace with its small gods, and the child had stood in the doorway with its fists clenched, exactly as expected, exactly as the map required, so that the aggressor would look at the doorway and not at the patient, silent, 11-year darkness behind it. They had declared war in the morning, certain they had already won. By the time their fleet drifted powerless above the world they had come to erase, unable to fire, unable to flee, their crews alive and their certainty gone forever, only hours had passed. Hours. And in those hours the Concordance of Nine had learned the thing that its 11,000 years of unbroken victory had never once taught it, the thing it would carry home into the drowned dark beneath Vess, and never, ever forget, that the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy is not the one who is strong. It is the one who has already assumed you might be lying, and has spent 11 years in perfect silence preparing to be right. They had regretted everything, and humanity, young and watchful and no longer anyone's weed, had simply let them live to remember why.